into the first movie house in Duvall. Opening night for the Duvall Theater, Christmas 1913. Tilly's Punctured Romance was the featured movie. Great Northern made special train runs from Tolt to allow people to catch a film in Duvall. Not all the news that first year was happy. Duvall's first fire claimed the popular cafe on June 1st. In a town constructed of wood, the inherent danger of fire would go on to claim a number of Duvall's most cherished buildings, including the original Valley House and the landmark Forest Inn. Duvall continued to grow. Farming and logging were the mainstays of the economy. Dairy, fruit, vegetable, and crop farming were all thriving here. Prior to the railroads, milk from dairy farms would be transported by a milk boat. Now, with train service available, the milk was taken to Novelty, where railroad cars were used to transport it to the condensery in Monroe. One of the local leaders in the timber industry was the Cherry Valley Shingle Company that employed over 40 men and produced thousands of shingles every day. Transportation continued to evolve in the region. The riverboats gave way to the trains, and the trains would one day give way to the automobiles and buses, which at this point were just starting to arrive on the scene. World War I ushered in a sobering chapter in Duvall's early history as young men throughout the valley enlisted for service. The war also impacted the local timber industry, as there was a heavy demand for spruce used in the framework of early warplanes. Soldiers were sent to logging camps to raise production levels of the Sitka spruce. Drama and danger were also found closer to home.
Now, in 1915, the town had a real Western adventure. They had their first official bank robbery. 4 men charged the bank, and the cashier filled a pillowcase with about $400 worth of silver coins.
I was a baby in a crib when that happened, so that was 97 years ago.
And they charged back out of the bank with guns blazing, crossed Main Street, ran down the alley between the hardware store and what is now the present Duvall bookstore.
And they were spilling it down, it went down the road down towards the river.
One made a break for the river, and he had the money with him, so they followed him. They cornered him down to riverbank, and they exchanged some more shots. And he jumped in and tried to swim the river. By then it was dark, and they shot at him, and they don't know if they hit him or not. They couldn't see him in the water anymore, but they found the pillowcase on the bank with the money in it.
And some of it went in the river. They even found some of it later, not too long ago. Got as far as Snohomish. It floated down the river, yeah. That was from that bank robbery.
1915 will always be known for the winter of the big snow. Over 36 inches of snow fell at the end of 1915 and the beginning of 1916. Ice on local ponds and lakes froze to the depth of 6 inches. One of the eventual hallmarks of Duvall, its diversity of residents, would never be as evident as it was during these years when the town population numbered less than 300. It was a cheerfully mismatched collection of farmers, loggers, rail workers, river boatsmen, and shopkeepers. And somehow, it all worked. As Duvall moved into the 1920s and 30s, the town would face many changes and challenges. 1921 saw a flood that some considered the worst in Duvall's history. Segments of the local economy began to slow down, especially in the timber industry. As more and more of the lumber resources were logged off, the large lumber camps began to close and move elsewhere. Improvements and advancements in automobiles would cause cutbacks in rail service, and the riverboats had all but disappeared from the scene. Last riverboat to come into Duvall, the stern-wheeler Black Prince in 1928. Times may have been economically challenging, but the ebb and flow of small-town life still went on for the residents of Duvall. town has always rallied around its high school sports teams. Duvall went basketball crazy in the 1920s as the men's high school team won the championship in 1921. This was actually the second championship team for Duvall, as 4 years earlier the girls' team took top spot in the King County Championship. Not sure if these championships were partly won in spite of or because of their home court, which was definitely not regulation in size or design. In 1922, the girls' team won county and came within 1 point from winning the state championship. Music and dancing has always had a long and lively history in Duvall and has always played an important role in the social life of the town. The second floor of Mannion's hardware store acted as a dance floor.
They would hold dances up there, and I remember Ralph Taylor telling me that the whole building would shake when they were dancing up there. And he would try to stay away from certain areas up there because he knew down below in the hardware store there was an area where they sold pitchforks and scythes and axes and things, and those were all sitting in display things. And he was afraid that if he was over one of them and that floor caved in, he'd be impaled on farm tools and stuff.
When it came to entertainment here in Duvall, we had to be resourceful, really, because we were used to that. That's the way we had grown up and lived. We would have regular picnics and hot dog roasts and so forth. And in the summertime, I remember a couple of gals with so much ambition brought down these kettles of corn all cooked.
Not all pursuit of fun back then would fall under the category of good idea.
Anyway, we were in Stan Chapman's basement, and there was a case of dynamite there. So, golly, we should try this out, see if it's any good or not. So we took 10 sticks and we wrapped them together. And we went up to the old Duvall Bridge, which was all wooden at that time. And we put the 10 sticks of dynamite halfway between the bridge and the river, and the fuse just short enough so it wouldn't drop in the water. And of course, the explosion went off. And the marshal of the town of Duvall, where the parking lot is down below the present-day bridge, was where his house was. Well, naturally, we woke him up with that dynamite. So he came running up the road, still putting his pants on, saw us, and he said, "Damn it, I know who did that." But so we got by with it, and we didn't do any damage. That was the good thing.
The national prohibition against alcohol was in effect during these days, and in some circles it was gladly embraced. For others, not so much. The economy may have been down, but school participation was up, partly due to the closure of Novelties High School, which brought all their students to join Duvall's classes. Even with a climbing enrollment, you wouldn't exactly say the school was bursting at the seams.
We had our own high school here, and I graduated from the high school here in 1934. I think we had a class of 13 that year.
Just getting to school was a challenge for many of the children. As a result, consistent attendance was noted and celebrated in the local newspaper. To add to their school challenges, farm chores were never far away.
It was my duty to get those eggs cartoned up, and first of all I had to candle them and carton them and get them ready. So after schools, that was my chore for the night.
I'd get up at 3 o'clock in the morning, rain, go down by horseback down to round up the cows for milking, and then we'd have breakfast with Big Jim because he's a wonderful cook. But we worked hard and we played hard. I tell people, our parents didn't realize that Abraham Lincoln freed the slaves in 1863 because they worked us real hard. I mean, a day off was still 8 hours work.
Some chores were more enjoyable than others. Velma Hicks Hill remembers working in her father's store as a young girl.
My dad would let me help him put things in the shelves. And so I said, "Would you like me to put the candy in the candy case and the dishes?" Because instead of boxes of chocolates, he's got those little dishes that we had. They look like chinaware. You know the rest, don't you? I would help myself a little bit once in a while.
There were side benefits to landing a job on the farm, namely the food.
Oh my gosh, I mean, there'd be steaks, roast, and pork, and chicken, and corn on the cob, and ice cream, and a lot of that ice cream was homemade. And if you walked out of that kitchen weighing less than 300 pounds, it was your own fault, because you knew you were going to work 200 of that off in that afternoon.
By the time the Great Depression struck, Duvall had economically come full circle and was once again relying mainly on the farming community for a livelihood. 60 families were involved in dairy farming at this time. The Snoqualmie Valley was not immune to the Great Economic Depression that began in 1929 and lasted for the better part of a decade. The Milwaukee Railroad discontinued passenger traffic, although they did offer bus service through the valley. It wasn't all doom and gloom. There was also progress and positive changes during this time. 1932 was also the year that Duvall not only had an all-female city council, it elected its first female mayor, Mabel Bork.
We promoted women both in business careers and in politics, and I thought, this is my kind of town. Look at all the women here running things.
Duvall's public library also emerged during the 1930s, in large part due to the efforts of the Duvall Civic Club. Their initial fundraising effort netted $25, and club members journeyed to Seattle, coming back with a haul of 70 used books on a variety of subjects. The 1940s were a turbulent time for the world. In Duvall, blackouts were ordered, and all buildings were to be sealed up so that no light would show at night in case of enemy air attack. Barns were a problem because they had a lot of windows, doors, and cracks where light could escape. One of Duvall's more unique contributions to the war effort was a small 12-by-12 building erected on 3rd and Stewart Street. Duvall's hut was part of the Army Air Force Civil Defense Program, keeping a watchful eye for German and Japanese aircraft. As the war years gave way to more peaceful times, Duvall in the 1940s and 50s moseyed along during what many have called the quiet years. The post office was moved to the Hicks Market, where Velma Hicks served as postmaster for the next 36 years. One of the best parts of going into Hicks's was going to the post office and visiting with Velma. She was just wonderful, and if you were just at least a decent human being, she was always nice to you. And, that's what you want in life, is to be around people that you can talk to about your kids or your family or whatever. Other changes included the Cherry Valley School discontinuing its high school program. This led to decades of local kids jumping on a bus and heading down the road to Tolk.
We loved our bus driver, Mr. Lundquist. I have gotten in trouble once on the bus. I put gum on the bus driver's seat, and he was really mad, and he found out it was me, and he was really disappointed in me because I would never do anything like that. And I'm really sorry I ever did that, Mr. Lundquist.
Church building and attendance was strong in those days, as Duvall now had a few different churches to choose from. Quite the difference from the days when virtually the entire town would turn out on Sunday mornings to attend services at the Methodist Church. 1951 saw the construction of Duvall's third bridge over the Snoqualmie River. This new structure was a welcome addition to the town.
The town at that time, the town limits extended from the bridge there at Virginia Street up to Stevens Street. And that was the extent of the city limits of the town. You could stand on Main Street and look down the street and see who was in town just by counting the cars parked on the side of the road.
Duvall boasted a homegrown celebrity during these years. Actress and singer Martha Wright, whose father was a local judge, made it all the way to Broadway, where she gained a major success as Mary Martin's replacement in South Pacific. She never forgot her roots, as evidenced by this radio broadcast.
My favorite stage role, as you might guess, was Nellie Forbush in South Pacific. My favorite real-life role, Martha Wright of Duvall, Washington.
A slow news day was common during these quiet years. But things were about to get very interesting in Duvall. The 1960s and 70s were here. Duvall's trademark melting pot of residents added a new ingredient in the 1960s and 70s, the long hairs. On the surface, it might have seemed an odd fit. This small farming, logging community, and members of that generation's counterculture. And yet, somehow, the relationship flourished.
When I first came to Duvall, there really wasn't a hell of a lot going on here. But it had interesting people living in it, and the people were courteous and nice.
There's a time when the counterculture people were looking for elbow room, freedom, and Duvall offered that. And a good number of those people live here to this day, and they're important to the people of Duvall.
Dairy farmers that lived down below on the river road occasionally would herd their cows through town. So all of a sudden it'd just be taken over with a whole herd of Holsteins coming through, which was quite amazing.
Their reasons for coming to the valley were as diverse as their backgrounds. I came here on a freight train in '69 and met Larry Vanover and Gary Eagle, and they lived out here in Duvall, and the plan was let's all move to Duvall and have our own little business out here in the country so we could ride horses to work.
Always had this fascination of making a little house of my own in a forest. I immediately built what has been referred to as a wooden tent.
And it was a slow life, and things were very peaceful and happy, and nothing was too crowded, and it was just great.
I think that when people talk about the hippie period of Duvall, there's some things that they probably might not understand. And the main thing is that the people that they're talking about weren't really hippies. They might have called us hippies behind our backs because in those days, if you had long hair, and you could have been a doctor, and they would have called you a hippie.
Back then there were some suspicious eyes being cast on the long hairs that were out here in the valley. And but once the people out here realized that we came out and wanted to live here and work here, then the doors started to open.
The town's secret weapon for bringing all of its various people and personalities together in happy harmony, the silver spoon.
It started out as probably the smallest building on Main Street in Duvall. Coincidentally and comically, next door to a barber shop. So you have this little hippie restaurant next door to a barber shop. Now, can you imagine the barber sitting there on a slow day, watching all that long hair go in the door? Those doors were about that far apart. The Silver Spoon was well known for its food. Everybody loved it.
The brownies were what were so good, that was the #1 draw, I think, with just these rich chocolate brownies, just to die for.
The cinnamon rolls were big, but they weighed less than an ounce. They were so light, and we would brush them with honey butter instead of frosting, so that was. We did tofu burritos, and we did biscuits and gravy. We did vegetarian lasagna, but we did prime rib. So that started something. That started the locals, the rednecks and the hippies coming together at the table because they all wanted that food. And there was something there for everyone.
And of course, the people who worked at the Spoon were beautiful women. And it was visually stimulating enough to draw every old codger in the valley into that place. And so in the mornings for coffee, there'd be a lot of elderly gentlemen in there with big smiles,
It became a destination restaurant for people from out of town, and they found the local color very interesting, I'm sure.
Duvall has always had a lively music scene, and and this era was no different.
Well, the most popular location for music in Duvall was, in its heyday, was the Silver Spoon, when it had an upper floor and they had a stage and they had everything, and the Riley and Maloney were out here, and Dave Van Ronk, and just Odetta. I mean, Lord, they had a lot of great acts out here. When Odetta sang here, it was one night, the lights went out and there was lightning, and she kept singing in the dark. It was just so neat,
I remember after I would bake, going home, and I would be in my car in the parking lot on a summer night, and they would have all the windows open in the Grange Hall upstairs, and I could hear some sing-along, which to many of us is kind of like, oh my God, a sing-along. But it was really great, really special to hear everybody singing together.
In the summer of 1968, the Sky River Rock Festival and Lighter Than Airfare was held nearby, America's first ever multi-day outdoor rock concert, featuring national acts such as Santana, Jesse Colin Young, and the Grateful Dead. There was still very much a small-town feel to Duvall.
The police department was actually created in 1984. I was hired the latter part of 1985. We didn't have much to start with. The old original City Hall, before it was remodeled for the third time, had an old stairwell that went up the back side with a little 8x8 office. We had a metal desk with a rotary dial telephone. I think there was one chair, and that was pretty much it, a scratch pad of paper and a couple pencils. So there were a lot of young kids that were obviously raised in the valley, and as one can imagine, we didn't have internet back in those early days or cable TV, so just like the adults who would find things to do on a Friday or Saturday,